Welcome to Tibet This Week, where we bring you weekly news edition on His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Tibet, and the Central Tibetan Administration. These are the headlines. Central Tibetan Administration celebrates 75th anniversary of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's assumption of spiritual and temporal leadership of Tibet. Sikyong Tsering embarks on an official visit to North and Northeast India. Central Election Commission conducts 2026 Tibetan General Election Workshop to regional election officers. Canadian parliamentarians honour His Holiness the Dalai Lama in the House of Commons. European Parliament celebrates the extraordinary legacy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in the Parliament. Central Tibetan Administration's leadership engaged with lecturer of Japan's National Defense Academy. Weekly Lookout, Year of Compassion. On Monday this week, His Holiness the Dalai Lama graced the event hosted by the Central Tibetan Administration, celebrating the 75th anniversary of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's assumption of spiritual and temporal leadership of Tibet. The event saw an estimation of 6,000 Tibetans and followers gathered at Tsering Monastery in Dharamsala. Dr. 𝑻𝒊𝒃𝒆𝒕 𝑻𝒉𝒊𝒔 Ambassador of the Czech Republic to India, attended as the guest. Delivering Kashak's statement, Sikyong Tsering remembered His Holiness the Dalai Lama's assumption of Tibet's spiritual and temporal leadership at an early age and His Holiness's tireless efforts in striving to safeguard Tibet's heritage and identity and its people from China's growing repression.
The sublime life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the great Bodhisattva, exemplified through his tireless efforts in fulfilling the four principal commitments and his immeasurable kindness transcend all expression.
Speaker 𝒃𝒆𝒕 𝑻𝒉𝒊𝒔, when delivering the statement of the Tibetan Parliament in exile, reflected on His Holiness's establishment of monastic institutions, a fully functioning democratic system of governance, and Tibetan schools in India. As we celebrate the year in honor of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Speaker 𝒃𝒆𝒕 𝒉𝒊𝒔 appealed to the Tibetans to stand united in contributing to His Holiness's efforts towards the Tibetan cause. At the event, Dr. 𝒊𝒃𝒆𝒃, in her address, applauded His Holiness's extraordinary leadership and drew attention to the genuine friendship His Holiness shared with former President of Czechoslovakia, late Václav Havel.
And our President Václav Havel invited His Holiness because he felt that this leader is very important for his leadership. So these two leaders, Václav Havel, the president, political leadership, and 14 Dalai Lama, His Holiness, are our very important connection between Tibet and Czechoslovakia, now Czech Republic.
The alumni of the Tibetan schools in India and Nepal offered gratitude to His Holiness the Dalai Lama at the event for the establishment of Tibetan schools in the Tibetan diaspora. Following multiple engagements in Dharamsala, Sikyong Tsering of the Central Tibetan Administration has embarked on an official visit to Delhi, Guwahati and Lucknow early this week. Yesterday, Sikyong spoke to the faculty and students of Cotton University on environment, security and peace, and on Wednesday this week, Sikyong attended the inaugural session of the 14th Tirth Yatra organized by Bharat-Tibet Sahyog Manch in Guwahati, Assam. On Monday, Delhi's Regional Khode Organizing Committee organized a panel discussion on the 75th anniversary of His Holiness's assumption of spiritual and temporal leadership of Tibet, where Sikyong Tsering attended as one of the panelists. Along with him on the dais were Tibetan historian and Professor Champa Samte, former Indian National Security Advisor and former Foreign Secretary Shiv Shankar Menon, former Indian diplomat and author Dilip Sinha, foreign policy analyst and strategic affairs expert Dr. Raja Mohan. At both events, Sikyong reflected on the historical independent status of Tibet, the ancient tie that India and Tibet shares through cultural contact, and Tibet's river that flows into India. Sikyong also highlighted Central Tibetan Administration's firm commitment to resolve Tibet's issue through a middle way approach under the guidance of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The Central Election Commission, chaired by Election Commissioner 𝒊𝒔 𝒉𝒔, conducted a one-day workshop for the regional election officers on the upcoming Tibetan General Election 2026 last Sunday. Chief Election Commissioner 𝒊𝒔 𝒉𝒔 elaborated on the election rules, regulations and fundamental guidelines governing the Tibetan electoral process. He underscored key procedures, including voter registration, voting methods, the responsibilities of election officers, handling of invalid ballots, and penalties for electoral misconduct. Additional election commissioners 𝒊𝒔 𝒉𝒔 and Tsering further briefed on the operational preparations and responsibilities for the upcoming elections. The preliminary round of Tibetan general election is scheduled for February 1st, 2026, and the final round of election is scheduled for April 26, 2026. November 17 marks as Canada-Tibet Lobby Day. On Monday this week, Canadian members of Parliament Karim Bardesi, Alexis Brunel, and James Maloney honored His Holiness the Dalai Lama and delivered statements supporting Tibet as they welcomed prominent Tibet supporter Richard Gere in the Canadian House of Commons. Parliamentarians recognized His Holiness the Dalai Lama as the embodiment of compassion, peace, and moral courage. They called on supporting Tibetans in choosing their religious leaders, including the next Dalai Lama, without external interference, to officially recognize 2025 as the Year of Compassion, and to recognize the historical status of Tibet as an occupied nation.
Mr. Speaker, Tibetans have been part of Canada's fabric since the 1970s, after China's occupation of Tibet in the 1950s forced many into exile. They are guided always by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and his lifelong commitment to nonviolence, interfaith harmony, and human rights.
This year, we celebrate the 90th birthday of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Following a request from His Holiness to then Prime Minister Lester Pearson, the first two Tibetan refugees landed in Canada on October 15, 1970, just over 55 years ago. Since then, Tibetan Canadians have been contributing to the Canadian economy, community, and social fabric of our country.
Mr. Speaker, we're incredibly fortunate to have Richard Gere here on Parliament Hill today, a fervent defender of rights and freedoms whose fight for the Tibetan people deserves to be applauded in this House. 2025 is a historic year, the 90th birthday of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama.
The Office of Tibet Brussels launched an exhibition titled His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet, celebrating 90 years of wisdom and compassion at the European Parliament. The event saw the presence of several members of European Parliament, parliamentary staffers, and invited guests. The two speakers at the event, member of European Parliament and co-chair of the Interparliamentary Group for Tibet, Dainus Delimas, and Representative Rigzin Gekang of the Office of Tibet Brussels, both highlighted His Holiness's decades-long commitment to peace, compassion, and non-violence. Speakers also reflected on His Holiness's numerous visits to the European Parliament. The Office of Tibet Brussels also conducted their second Belgian-Tibetan networking meet, bringing together 26 young Tibetan youth across Belgium. This week, Kota Kanimaki, lecturer at Japan's Keio University and the National Defense Academy, had separate interactions with Speaker 𝒊𝒃𝒆𝒕 𝑻𝒉𝒊𝒔 of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile and Deputy Speaker Doma Tsering Tekang at the Speaker's Chamber, and with Kali Nonzi Doma and Secretary Kama Chuing of the Department of Information and International Relations. The meetings covered a wide range of pressing issues of Tibet, including China's Sinicization policy inside Tibet, China's colonial boarding school, absence of freedom of all kinds, and self-immolations amongst Tibetans as a result. As part of the ongoing Khotun Year of Compassion celebration, the documentary film Wisdom of Happiness was screened at the Hetley Bull Building at the Australian National University, co-hosted by the Australia-Tibet Council and ANU School of Culture, History and Language. Representative Kama Singhe of the Office of Tibet Canberra attended the screening. Within India, the Tibetan Parliament in Exile, in collaboration with Dalai Lama Chair, Punjab University, presented a photo exhibition titled Democracy, a Gift of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to the Tibetan People at Punjab University, Chandigarh. Kamrao Kappa Tibetan Settlement organized a live release initiative of 555 fish into the Kulal River as a symbol of kindness towards all beings and prayers for His Holiness's long life. Manjushri Center of Tibetan Culture, in collaboration with the Darjeeling Local Khotun Committee, organized an event where the local Tibetan residents collectively pledged to prioritize the use of Tibetan language, both within the settlement and at home, thereby reaffirming their commitment to the cultural preservation of the Tibetan language. That is all for this week's edition of Tibet This Week. See you in the next one.